Hey guys, welcome to my 2021 React crash course. So it's been about 2 years or so since my last one, and I wanted to create an updated version. And this course is meant for beginners. I'll be explaining some of the core concepts and fundamentals of React. We're going to be building a task tracker application, looking at components, props, state. We're going to use React hooks. And we're also going to be dealing with something called JSON Server, which is a mock REST API, or kind of like a fake backend that we can use. So I can show you how we would use React in a full stack application where we're making requests to an API. We're going to look at routing and a whole bunch of other stuff. So the first thing I want to do is just go through some slides, and then we'll go ahead and jump into writing code. So first off, what is React? The standard definition is it's a JavaScript library for building user interfaces. And you may have heard of it referred to as a framework. I refer to it as a framework. Most people do, and I'll talk about why in a second. Now, React it was created and it's maintained by Facebook. It's strictly front end, meaning it runs in the browser. When you have a web app that's built with, let's say, PHP, you're running PHP on the server, your app is hosted on the server, and then it serves HTML templates or HTML pages to the client. With React, you build what's called a single page application, or a SPA, where you have a single HTML page, and then all of your routing, all of that stuff is done through React, which then compiles to a JavaScript bundle that's loaded by the browser. So it makes for really fast and interactive interfaces. Now, even though React is a front-end framework, so it can't directly, for instance, communicate with your database, it's often used in combination with other technologies to create a full-stack application. For instance, the MERN stack, which is really popular. It's MongoDB, which is a type of database, Express, which is a back-end framework, React, and then Node.js, which is a JavaScript runtime. You could also use React on the front end and use PHP Laravel on the back end, or Python Django. And what you would do is you would serve JSON data from your server, and you would make requests from React to the server to get data, to add data, update, delete, and so on. Now, as far as being a library versus a framework, most people call it a framework, and that's because it's directly comparable to something like Angular or Vue.js. Now, it doesn't have as much included as Angular does. Like, Angular has a built-in routing system. React doesn't. You just have to install an extra package called React Router DOM. So it has an entire ecosystem of packages that you can install to make it function as a full-fledged framework. Now, as far as a library goes, when I think of a library, I think of like jQuery, Lodash, something where you pull utilities in and you use them in your application. React doesn't work like that. It works more like Angular or Vue. And those three are actually the top frameworks in the industry right now. I would go as far as to say React is the most popular. But the other two are great as well. I have crash courses on those. I'll be updating soon. So when you're choosing one of these three frameworks, if you're going to be a front-end developer or a full-stack developer, you just want to compare them, use each one, test them out, see what you really click with, and also look at jobs in your area if that's what your goal is. All right, so we know that React is a front-end library/framework. Now, why would you want to use it? There's actually a bunch of reasons, but one of the biggest is it gives you a way to structure the view layer of your application. So MVC, or Model View Controller, is a popular design pattern for software. The model deals with the data, the controller deals with the requests and routing, and then the view is the UI, the user interface, the part of the app that the user sees. React is basically the V in MVC. Now, if you've tried to build a large dynamic interface using JavaScript, vanilla JavaScript, it can get really messy. Your HTML, your styling, and your JavaScript logic are just all over the place, and everyone writes vanilla JavaScript differently. React allows you to build your UI using what are called reusable components. So every part of your user interface is looked at as a dynamic component that can hold its own state and data. We also don't have to separate our markup from our logic because React uses something called JSX, or JavaScript Syntax Extension. And this allows us to basically write dynamic HTML. It's actually JavaScript, but it's formatted like HTML. We can even embed JavaScript expressions, variables, etc. Now, the apps that you build with React are very interactive because it uses something called the virtual DOM. which is the document object model. So what this does, it allows you to update parts of the page that need to be updated without reloading it. So if you have a list of users, or in our case, a list of tasks, and you want to delete one of them, it doesn't have to reload the page. It does everything behind the scenes. If you were to build, let's say, a traditional PHP application where you're just serving HTML templates, every delete you make, it most likely is going to have to refresh the page. So this makes things much more faster, more dynamic, and interactive. React also has performance and testing benefits. Another huge reason to learn React is it's very big in the industry right now. Just by the way it structures everything, it makes it much easier to work on projects with teams rather than just having a bunch of jumbled JavaScript. So managing data is also really easy with one-way data binding. All the data in your state is immutable, meaning you can't mutate it directly, and React provides ways to basically recreate your state every time that it needs to be changed. So this helps with debugging and also offers better performance. So what should you know before learning React? This can vary depending on person to person, but generally you want to have a good handle on JavaScript. You don't want to go from learning HTML and CSS and then jump right into React. You should know all the fundamentals of JavaScript, including things like data types, variables, functions, loops, etc. In React and JavaScript in general, you work with a lot of asynchronous code, so you should be familiar with things like promises. Array methods such as for each, map, filter, reduce, these are all commonly used in React applications, so get familiar with those. Doing algorithms, that's a really good way to practice these array methods. And then the fetch API is used to make HTTP requests to either your own backend server or to a third-party API, for example, the GitHub or YouTube API. So get familiar with fetch. Again, I have crash courses on most of the stuff that you can check out if you want. So as I said, with React and in pretty much any front-end framework, you're going to be looking at your user interface as a bunch of components. So here's the app we'll be building. It's just called Task Tracker. It's pretty simple. You just add a task with a day and a time. You can set a reminder, and you'll be able to double-click and set the reminder to either true or false, which will show this border, and we can delete and so on. Now over here, I just have outlined or created a border around each of the components. So we have the green around the header component, and inside the header we have a button component. We have the add task component here, which we could actually break down even further and create input components as well if we wanted to. Down here we have the tasks component, the purple, which wraps around all of these, and then each individual task is also its own component. All right, and then we have down here the footer component. We're also going to look at routing a little bit, so we have this about link, and that's going to go to a separate route that will show the about component. All right, so you can go to any website or any UI. You go to Twitter and look at the different components, the list of tweets, each tweet itself, the box to post a tweet, all your followers, everything can be looked at as a component. So that's kind of the mind frame that you want to be in when you're working with React or even Angular or Vue. Now, as far as how we create components in React, they can be created with both classes and functions, or functions, I should say. Now, we'll be focusing mostly on function components with hooks, which seems to be kind of the more common way to do things these days. In my 2019 React crash course, we focused on classes. So if you really want to dive into class-based components, you can check the older crash course out. So on the left we have a component called header. This is formatted as an arrow function, but of course it could be a traditional function as well. It simply returns a div with an h1. Now on the right is the same component as a class, and you can see it's defined as a class and it extends react.component, which is going to give us everything in the root component class to work with, including the render method, which takes care of rendering it out on the screen. And in render, we're just returning the same thing we're returning here. Now what's being returned looks like HTML, but it's actually just syntactic sugar for JavaScript, which is called JavaScript Syntax Extension, or JSX. And it's similar to the HTML syntax, aside from a few things, like instead of the class attribute, you have to use class name. But in addition to that, you can also put any kind of JavaScript expression into your JSX to make it dynamic. And then once you have your component created, you can embed it into other components with this type of syntax, which is similar to like XML. So we would just have header. We can also pass in props, which are basically attributes. So we could pass in a title of whatever we want into the component and then work with it inside of the either the function or the class, whatever we're using. All right, so components are not just static markup, they're dynamic, and they can contain something called state. So state is basically just an object that determines how a component renders and behave. So an example would be if you have, let's say, a collapsible menu that would have an open and close state. So you might have a state object in your component that has a value of open that could be either true or false. Now, if you have a list of users or tasks or whatever it might be, that's also part of the state. So any data that you bring into your components, that's going to be part of the state. And a lot of times you want to share that data across multiple components. So in that case, you would use what's called either app state or global state. Now, sometimes you end up having just a ton of app level state that gets really difficult to manage. So in that case, you have a few options. You could use the context API, which is built into React, or you could use a third-party state manager like Redux, which is way beyond the scope of this crash course, but I did want to mention it, and I do have other videos on those. Now, prior to React version 16.8, we had to use class components if we wanted to hold state. So function components were actually called dumb components because they couldn't hold state. However, in version 16.8, React introduced something called hooks, which allow us to use state and other lifecycle functions within function components. And that's what we'll be focusing on in this crash course. Specifically the useState hook, which allows us to return a stateful value along with a function to update it. There's other hooks as well. useEffect is used to perform side effects in function components. We'll be using that towards the end. One of the biggest uses for useEffect is to make HTTP requests when the page loads. So if you're fetching data from an API on page load, you'll want to use useEffect. There's a bunch of others as well. There's useContext, useReducer, but those are beyond the scope of this crash course. All right, so if those last few slides didn't really make much sense at all, don't worry about it because we're gonna have plenty of examples throughout the course and throughout this application that we're gonna build. So we're gonna build out our user interface first and then also implement towards the end something called JSON Server, which we're gonna use as kind of a fake back end so you can see how React would work if you were building a full stack application and making requests to a backend or an API. All right, so enough with the slides. Let's go ahead and jump in and let's get started with React. All right, so we're going to get started now. There's a bunch of ways to basically start a React application. One of the most common and easiest ways is using a program called Create React App, which is a CLI. It's a command line interface tool to just easily get up and running and set up a boilerplate with all the files and folders and packages that you need. It also has a development server. It has a way to build out your static assets to deploy. So to install this, we need to use NPM, which is the Node Package Manager. And in order to use that, you have to have Node.js installed on your system. I'm sure that a lot of you already do. If you don't, just go to nodejs.org, download it, install it. Doesn't matter if you're on Windows, Mac, or Linux. Another thing I would suggest installing is the React Dev Tools. If you're on Chrome, there's a Chrome extension. There's a Firefox extension as well. And it just allows you to kind of see all of the components and props and state of your React application. So we're going to install this. We're actually going to use the npx command instead of installing it globally with npm. What this does is it just runs Create React App and creates the folder for us rather than installing Create React App on your system. So first of all, make sure you have npm. You can do npm version. Make sure it's above 5.2 or you won't be able to use npx. And then let's do npx create React app, and I'm going to call this actually let's call it react-task-tracker, because I will be doing a Vue.js and Angular course and we'll be doing the same application. And this is just going to set up all of the files and folders that we need. It's going to install all the packages that we need and so on. Okay, so that's all set. Now you just want to open that folder up in your text editor. I'm using VS Code, so I'm going to cd into react-task tracker, and I'm going to run code and then dot, which just means I want to open VS Code in the current folder. All right, so now over here you can see all the files and folders. I'm just going to make this bigger for now. And I just want to go over some of this. So package.json if we look at the dependencies that are included, of course, we have the React library. We have React DOM, which is responsible for rendering our React application out to the document object model, to the browser. If you were to use, let's say, React Native, you'd have the same React library, but you would also have React Native instead of React DOM. Okay, React Scripts comes with the development server, the build tool, and so on, everything that Create React app offers. And then you have some testing libraries, which we're not going to get into in this crash course. Down here we have our start script. So npm start will run the development server on localhost 3000. npm run build will build out our static assets for deployment. And we have test for testing, and then eject will basically allow you to, if you want to change something in the Webpack config, if you want to expose other libraries and packages that are kind of hidden that run behind the scenes, you can eject, but there's really not a lot of cases where you would have to do that. All right, so let's go ahead and run the dev server. I could run it just in my terminal here, but I'm going to go ahead and command tilde and open up my integrated terminal in VS Code. So from here we can run npm start, and that's going to start up the dev server. So when this starts up on localhost 3000, this is the development build. If you look at the React Dev Tools, if you installed them, it says this page is using the development build of React. If you if you build, you'll have all your static assets in the build folder. If you run it from there, it'll say it's the production build. All right, so let's close this stuff up. We don't need that. And I'm just going to, we'll make this smaller so we can see both of these at the same time. And I just want to go over some of the other stuff we have here. So in the public folder, we have an index.html. So this is essentially the single page of the single page application that's being loaded. And it's actually really simple. There's a bunch of comments here that make it look more complicated than it actually is. So we'll just get rid of these. But it's just a simple HTML file. And we have some meta tags and some stuff in the head, but if you look in the body, all there really is a div with the ID of root. So this is kind of the gateway to our UI, to our React application. And the way this works, if we look in the source folder, which is where we put all of our components and state and everything that has to do with our app that we're building, if we look in the index.js here, which is kind of the entry point for React, we're importing React DOM, and then there's a method on React DOM called render. And what we're doing is we're grabbing that div that I just showed you with the ID of root, with document.getElementById root, and we're inserting our app into that div. Now this app comes from app.js, which we're importing right here, and app.js contains the root app component. So remember, I said to think of everything in components. Well, app is the root the root component. So every component that we create, like our header, our events, footer, the add form, all that stuff is going to be in this main root app component. Okay, and then that is what's being put into that div right here. Okay, so I just wanted to kind of explain that. Now, let's see. Actually, I just want to change the title here. We'll change it to task tracker, and you could put if you want to use the bootstrap CDN or something like that, you could use this file for that kind of thing. But we'll go ahead and save that, and this updates right away, or it should. I don't know why it didn't that time, but this will auto reload. So I want to go into now app.js, and this is the root app component, and everything that you see here is coming from this component here. So we're importing logo, which is this logo SVG. It's this spinning React logo. We're also importing an app CSS file, which is just some basic styling. And then we have a function. Now remember, components can be functions or classes. Most people these days seem to use functions with hooks, which is what we'll be focusing on. But this could be a class. I might give you an example of that. But if we look in the return of this function, it looks like HTML, but this is actually JSX, JavaScript Syntax Extension. And there's a few differences. For instance, you might notice class name. We can't use the class attribute to assign a class. We use class name. Same with for. If you have a label with a for attribute, you don't want to use for in React. You would use HTML for, like that. All right, so just keep that in mind. This is also dynamic. We can have JavaScript expressions and variables. Here we're bringing in logo, adding it to the source of the image. What I'm going to do though is just get rid of everything that's inside of this div. And for now, let's just put, if you want Emmet to work in here, you can see it's not working right now. It might for you. If it doesn't, click where it says JavaScript. You can change that to JavaScript React, and then it should work. So let's just say hello from React for now. I'm going to save that, and this will auto reload. And we don't need to bring in the logo and app CSS. And we also don't need some of these files anymore. So logo I'm going to get rid of, app CSS. I also don't want app test and setup test since we're not dealing with that. So we'll go ahead and delete those 4 files just to clean things up a little bit. Now, when we're returning this JSX here, you can only return a single parent element. So you can put whatever you want in this div, and it doesn't have to be a div. It can be a paragraph, it could be a heading, it could be just a fragment, which I'll show you in a second. But if I go under here and I try to put, like, let's say an H2, and I say hello, you'll see I'm already getting an error here, and it won't compile. So it says JSX expressions must have one parent element. So whatever you return, it has to be a single element, and then anything else, any other components or whatever you want can go inside of it. So I'm going to move this H2 up into the div, and that should fix it. Okay. Now let's go ahead and open up the dev tools here. I'm going to go to the Elements tab just to show you what this compiles to. So we have a div with the ID of root that wraps around our entire UI. Then we have this div with the class of app, and then our headings. So we're seeing this right here. Now obviously class name is going to compile out to just a regular HTML class. If you don't want to have a div or any element around like these headings or whatever we have in here, we could just use a fragment or just an empty angle bracket. If I save that and we check this out, it's just the H1 and H2. Of course, we still have the root div, which wraps around everything, but as far as this component goes, it's not going to have a div or anything wrapped around these. But I actually do want a div, and I'm going to have a class name of container for some styling that I'm going to add later. Okay, so you'll see that gets changed to div with the class of container. Now we can add expressions in here, and we can use variables. So for instance, if I were to say const name, and make sure you do this above the return, of course, and set a name to Brad, and I go down here and I put in some curly braces, I can then put name in here and I get hello Brad. Okay, I can also do like we could say 1 + 1, and that's going to render out to 2. I can do conditionals as ternary operators. So let's say const x equals true, and then I could go down here and I could say if x, then we'll show yes, else then we'll show no. And this is just a ternary operator. So hello yes, if I change this to false and save, we get hello no. All right, so you can write JavaScript directly in here, which makes it really nice, really dynamic. All right, so I'm just going to get rid of that. And now we're going to work on just creating our own components. Okay, remember I said to think of your app or your user interface as just a bunch of components. So we're going to start with the header. I'm going to go over to source, my source folder, create a folder called components. And this is where we're going to create all of our components. The first one we're going to call, we're going to call this header.js, uppercase, oops, didn't mean to do that, uppercase H, that's just the convention for components. And this could be a class or a function, and there's an extension for VS Code that I'd highly recommend if you're using it, if you're using VS Code, and that's ES7 React Redux GraphQL React Native Snippets, which has a bunch of snippets for things like imports, exports, even like loops and just regular JavaScript stuff, but it also has these snippets for components. So RCC will create a class-based component. RCE will create a class component, but it will export down at the bottom here. The one that I like to use is the arrow function. I believe it's RAFCE, this one right here. So it's nice and clean. It's just an arrow function that exports down at the bottom. So what I'll do is just do RA with that extension installed, RAFCE enter. And that creates just a boilerplate of a component, of an arrow function component. Now this here, it's importing React because this used to be required for every React component. However, we don't need this anymore, so we can actually get rid of it. Now, as far as what I want to output for the header, I'm going to use a header tag as my just parent element, and then we'll put an H1 in here, and we'll say task tracker. Now, if I save it, nothing's going to happen because we just created the component. We didn't put it into our application. So back in our app.js, let's go ahead and import header from, and we want to go into /components/header, and we just embed it just like it was like an XML tag. So header, just like that, save it, and now we have task tracker. Now, just to show you a class-based component real quick, I'm just going to comment this out, and if we use a class, we do need to import React from React. I haven't done a class in quite a while. So we could say class, we'd call it the same thing, app, but we need to extends react.component because we need all the lifecycle methods and all that. And then we'd have a render. So render takes care of the output. And then in this render, we would return whatever we want. As far as JSX, I'll just put an H1 and say hello from a class. Now, if I save that, I believe we're going to have to reload since so now we get hello from a class. And let's just make sure we have no errors here. Header is defined but never used. That's fine. All right, so I mean, if you want to use classes, you can, and you can check out my older crash course if you want to just use classes. But I'm going to go ahead and delete that, and let's uncomment this. And there we go. So now we have our header back. Now I want to talk a little bit about props because you can pass stuff in here. Like if we want to pass in a title to our header, and for now we'll just say hello. Now it's not going to do anything because we're not handling it, but we can pass anything we want in to retrieve this prop inside of our component here. We take in props as a parameter. And then down here, let's say we want to replace this static text with our props.title. If I save that, now we see hello because that's what's being passed in. Now we can also have default props. So if I don't pass anything in here and I save that, that's not going to show anything because there's no title. However, I could go below the function, the component, and say header.default props and set that to an object and set the title to task tracker. Now if I save that, that's going to show up because that's the default. If I were to again pass something in here, it would overwrite the default. Now this props.title, we could clean this up a little bit. Props is it's just going to be an object of whatever props you pass in, so we can destructure. So we can just add curly braces and take in the title. And then down here, we don't need to do props.title. We can just go like that. And that's going to give us the same exact result. Now, there's also PropTypes, which is kind of like a built-in type system for your properties. It's not something you have to use, but it's something that will help you out and make your code a little bit more robust. I'm not going to focus on creating PropTypes for everything, but I just want to kind of show you how it works. Now with the extension, the ES7 React extension, you can do IMPT to import PropTypes. And then what we can do is go down here and say header.PropTypes lowercase, set that to an object. And we know we have a title, so the title, and we can create a type. Do we want this to be a string, a number, a Boolean? We want this to be a string, so uppercase P PropTypes dot string. Now if I were to go back here and pass in, let's say title and pass in a number. Now if you're passing in a number or a Boolean or something, you want to have it wrapped in curly braces. But we'll pass in a 1, and right away down here in the console, it's still going to render, but you'll see we get this warning, invalid prop title of type number supplied to header, which expects a string. Okay, so it's just a way to kind of make your code more robust and catch errors before they happen. And you can also use something like TypeScript with React as well. All right, and then if it's required, you can do .is required as well. All right, and we have a default prop, so it's not going to give us any error, but if I were to get rid of the default prop and reload, you'll see I'll get a warning down here. All right, so we'll go ahead and keep header as is. And I want to talk a little bit about styling, because there's a few ways you can do, CSS within React. So one is to just use a style sheet, which is what ultimately we're going to do. I'm going to use this index CSS. I already have some styles prepared, but you can also use something like style components, which is an external package that is really popular. You can also use direct CSS in JavaScript. So I'm going to give you an example of that. So this H1 here, we could set style, and when you use style, you want to use double curly braces if you're doing it inline like this. And let's say we wanted to change, let's say color, and we would set that to a string of whatever color value. So if I set that to red, if I want to add something else, I'd put a comma, like say background color. Now it's not going to be background dash color like CSS, it's going to be camel case like this, and set it to a string. So we'll say black. Save that. Okay, another thing we can do if you don't want to do it inline like this, you could create a variable down here. We could say our heading, we'll say heading style, and set that, and then just grab both of these, cut that out, put those in here, and then use single curly braces here and pass in our heading style, and that's going to do the same thing. All right, I'm not going to be using this except where we have some dynamic styling, so I'm going to get rid of this, but I will keep this down here just to kind of remind you that you can do this. We'll say CSS in JS. All right, now I'm going to add some CSS. So this index style sheet, we're going to get rid of that, and you can get this code, you can get this whole thing in the GitHub repository in the description. So just grab the styling, paste it in. I'll go through it real quick. It's pretty simple. We're using the Poppins font. We have a reset. The container is going to be 500 pixels wide with a border. Header is going to be flexbox. We're going to have a button on the side. Button classes, button styles, events. So our list of events will be styled. Our form and form control, and then our footer. So pretty simple. I'm going to go ahead and save that, and it's going to look like this. Let me just make this a little wider, like that. All right, so we'll close that up, and we shouldn't have to touch the index CSS anymore. Now the next thing that I'd like to do here is add a button. So next to the H1, let's put a button here. And this is going to say add for now. So we save that. Yeah, we also want to add a class here of header, because that's what I have in the style sheet. That's going to make it a flex box and align it side by side. And then I also, whoops, that should be class name. And then I also want to add a class name here of btn. I'm using single quotes. All right, so now we have our button. So as far as components go, you can make whatever you want into a component. So if we want this, if we want to create a button component in case we want to add more buttons with maybe different colors and different texts and events, we can do that. So I'm going to create a file in components called button.js. And we're going to just map out a function here, and we don't need this. So I'm actually going to copy, or not copy, but cut this out of here, and we're just going to return this button directly. And then in our header, we're going to bring that button component in. So it's in the same folder, so just /button, and then we'll put that here. And we're going to see the same result. Now, I want to be able to take in a couple props into this button. So one will be color. So we'll pass in a color of, let's say, green. We'll have text. Let's say add. Actually, let's change it just so we can make sure that we're actually seeing that. So we're passing in a green and text prop into button. So remember, we catch props here. We could just use props and use it as an object, but I'm going to destructure that object and take color and text. And let's add right here, instead of the static add text, we'll add our prop. And then for the color, we'll go ahead and add style and set that to, let's use double curly braces here, and we're going to actually set the background color. So background color is going to be set to color. So we'll save that, and now we have a green button that says hello. So if we wanted to add other buttons, we could copy this down, and this one here, this one here, we could say hello 1, this one hello 3, and we could change colors, blue, red. So this is what I mean by reusable components. Obviously that doesn't look good, but you get the point. We can reuse this component with different props. So I just want the first one, and I'm going to change the text to add and save that. And then in our button, we can also have default props. So we could say button dot default props, and we could set the color. Let's set that to, we'll use I don't know, steel blue. And we could also use our prop types. So up here, import our prop types, and button dot. This first one is going to be lowercase. This confused me for a long time. So we have our text, which is going to be PropTypes dot string, and then we have the color, PropTypes dot string. Now we're gonna get into events quite a bit throughout this course, but let's talk a little bit about that now. So let's say I want to have an event on this button. I could just add right here, I could say on click, and set that to a function called on click, and I could go up here and create that function. So const on click, and we could do a console log and just say click. So if I go over here, if I click, you can see it's going to log that down here. You can also pass in the event object. So if you want to get the position of the element that's clicked or whatever, there's a lot of things you can access with that. But since this is a component, it's not always going to have the same click. So what we'll do is we'll have that click as a prop, right? So in here, let's say on click, and for now we'll just set this to a function here called on click in our header. So const on click. This isn't going to stay. I'm just putting it here for now, and we'll say console log click. All right, now this is getting passed in as a prop, so in our button we have to catch it here, just like we did with the other ones, and we can get rid of this, because what's going to happen is this will call this on click, and it'll get sent up to the header or wherever you embed this button. Now down here in the prop types, we could add on click, say we want that as a PropTypes.func because it's a function, and we could say it is required because you're most likely going to want a button to click. Well, actually, no, we'll get rid of it. We don't need that. It's required. So we'll save that, Now if I go and let's just reload that and click add, we see click. Okay, because we embedded this button component and we had the onClick prop just call this function here. Now we're gonna later on, this is gonna toggle the form, but we're not gonna do that just yet. I just kind of wanted to give you an idea of how events work. I could have made it on double click, on submit. There's a whole bunch of different events that you can add. Now I want to start to talk about state, and we're going to start dealing with our tasks. So let's close up header and button, and we're going to create in components. I'm going to create a new file called tasks.js. So this is our task component. So let's sketch out a component here, and we can get rid of this. And for now, I'm just going to create a variable called tasks up here and set that to an array, and I'm just going to paste in 3 different tasks. They're just objects with an ID, text, day, and a reminder, which is just a Boolean value. All right, now ultimately this is not the way that we want to do this. We want the task to be part of our state. So I'll show you how to integrate that into our component in a minute, but I just want to first show you how we can map through these or loop through these tasks and output something based on, for each one. So we do that by creating what's called a list. And we create a list by using the map array method, which is just JavaScript. You should be familiar with like for each, map, filter, and so on. I'm not going to really explain those too much, but in this tasks, we actually don't need a div, so we'll just use an empty fragment here. And then I'm going to open some curly braces and take my tasks, and we want to do .map to create a list. Now map takes in a function, so I'm going to use an arrow function, and I'm going to set this just to some parentheses with some JSX inside. Now for each task, I'll call it task, and then in here, let's just for now, we'll put an H1, let's do like an H3, and let's say we want the task dot, is it text? Yeah, so we'll just get the text for each one and output that. All right, if I save that, nothing shows because we haven't brought in the task component yet. So let's go up here into app.js and let's say tasks, and then go under the header here and say tasks. All right, so we'll save that. And notice that it's showing an H3 of each of the task text. Okay, so in addition to that, we have a warning that says each child in a list should have a unique key prop. So when we use .map in here and we output JSX, that's called a list. So the parent of the list, which in this case is an H3, should have a key prop, and that should be something unique. So we'll use the task.id because those are unique. So if I save that and we reload, that's going to get rid of the console warning down here. Now ultimately, like I said, we don't want this to be separate from our component. We want this to be part of our state. So what I'm going to do is just cut the array itself and delete this. And to use state inside of a function, we use a hook called useState. So let's say import, and then in curly braces, we want to take useState, and that's from React directly. Okay, now the way we do this is above the return, we're going to say const brackets, and then what we want to call this piece of state, which is tasks, and then a function to update the state, which we're going to call setTasks. We want to set that to useState, and then in here is the default that we want to use for this piece of state for our tasks, which I'm going to go ahead and just paste in that array. All right, now if I save this, you'll see that there's no difference here because this tasks variable is still, it's still being used right here, except instead of having it come from outside of our component, it's now part of our component state. If we wanted to change any part of the state, we would use setTasks. It's important to know that you wouldn't do something like tasks.push if you wanted to add to it, because state is immutable. It's not something that you can directly change. You basically recreate it and send it down. It's one-way data. So to do that, you would use setTasks instead, and then change it to whatever you want. If you wanted to spread across what's already there and then add a new object, you could do that. Now, we don't really want to have our tasks in the tasks component because we're going to want to access these from other components. So you could use something like the context API or Redux, where you would have a kind of a store that hovers over your UI where you could pull different pieces of state from, but we're not going to get into that. So what we want to do is just put it in our app.js. That will make it our global state. Then we can pass it down into components that we want as props. So what I'll do is take this, we'll cut that out, and we're going to instead put that in our app.js. And then I'm also going to take this whole thing where we define this task and set task and cut that. All right, and then we're going to put that in our app. So this is going to break for a second, don't worry about that. But we're going to put that in here. So now this is part of our app component state or our app level state. And what we can do is take our task and pass them into our task component as a prop. So we want to set task equals tasks. It's still not going to work because tasks right here isn't defined. But remember, it's being passed in as a prop. We could do props and then props.tasks, or we can just destructure and tasks. And now it works. Okay, if I reload, console should clear. So now we have our state where it should be, which is at the top level, because we want to be able to use these within other components, or we may want to. If we keep it in task, we can't. We can only use it in components we embed in here, or we would have to send it up. It gets really messy. So the next thing I want to do is, instead of just rendering out an H3 for each task, I want to have a separate task component. So let's create a new file called just task singular JS, and let's create a component. And what we'll do here, how do I want to style this or format this? Let's do a div and give this a class name. Oh, you know what? My CSS, I believe, is wrong. I have events because I was going to use events instead of tasks. So let me just change this. This will be different. This will be correct in your version. But let's say task instead of event. And save that. Okay, so now we'll set this class name equal to task, and then in here we'll have an H3, and we're going to get passed in here. Actually, for now, let's just say my task. And then what I'll do is in our tasks, we'll import the singular task component. So that's going to be from /task. And then instead of an H3, this is actually going to be a task component. And instead of doing this, instead of wrapping this, I'm just going to get rid of that. Go like that. We're still going to have the ID, but we want to pass in each task as a prop. Okay, so we're looping through them here, and then we're outputting a component, and we're passing the task in as a prop. So we'll save that. And now all we're seeing is my task because that's all we're putting here. However, we're going to catch that prop. We're going to take in the, actually we don't, yeah, we'll just say task. And in the H3, we'll say task dot, I think it's text. Yep, so now we're seeing our task text. Task text. I feel like I'm saying a freaking nursery rhyme or something. So in addition to that, we're going to want, let's do a paragraph, and we have the day, so task.day. Save that. There we go. Looks good. Let's see, what else do we want to do? We're going to want to have a delete icon. So I guess we can do that. You could include I'm going to use Font Awesome. You could include Font Awesome, the CDN, in your index.html in your public folder. However, what I'm going to do is install React icons, which allows you to use multiple icon libraries. So I'm going to leave my dev server running, open a new tab, and say npm install react-icons. So that way we can just bring in an icon that we want to use and use it instead of using a CDN. Okay, so React Icons is installed, and if you look in your package.json, you should see React Icons. Anything you install with npm, as long as it's local and not global, you're going to see in here. So we want to bring in a specific icon. So we're basically using icons as React components. We're going to bring in FA times, which is the X icon, from React Icons, and then /FA for font awesome, because there's multiple libraries that you can use with this. And then I'm going to go, let's go within the H3 right here. So after the text, we're going to put in FA times, just like we would put in any component, and save. And I think we have to restart the server after we install React Icons. So I'm going to go back to my dev server and stop that, Control C or Command C, npm start. And there we go. So now you can see we have the X icons. Now I want to make them red, so I'm going to add a style to this. So we'll say we want the color to be red, and let's make the cursor a pointer. All right, so now we have our delete icons. Now we want to make it so that when we click this, it deletes that particular event. But how do we do that when we don't have access to the events here? Remember, the events are stored in the app.js, in the app component. Now, if you were using like the context API or Redux, there's ways to access your state from within components pretty easily, but Redux, I mean, there's a lot of boilerplate, and it can be a little difficult to learn like reducers and stuff like that. So in this case, what we can do is just use props. We can send down a function as a prop and then fire that off when we click in here. So in the app.js, let's create a function. So whenever we want to delete a task or add or anything like that, it's going to be in this file. So let's say delete task, and we'll create a function called delete task, and that's going to take in a specific ID. And for now, we're just going to console log the text delete, and we'll also log the ID. All right, now we're going to pass in a prop to tasks, because remember, a task where the actual button is, that is in the task.js, and then that's in tasks. So we want to pass in, let's call this prop on delete, and basically when that's fired off, it's going to call delete event. All right, now on delete is now a prop of delete event. I'm sorry, delete task. I'm going to do that a few times through this because I decided to change it to tasks at the last minute. So this is going to be delete task. All right, and then on delete is going to be a prop of tasks. So just like we passed in tasks, we want to pass in on delete, and then that's going to get passed in here as a prop as well, because that's where we want to use it. So on delete equals on delete, and then in task, again, pass in on delete as a prop. However, we want to call that on a click, right? So in this FA times, let's say on click, and set that to on delete, which is going to basically work its way up to here and call delete task. So state gets passed down, actions get passed up. So if I click this, we do get the delete text, but we also see this event stuff, because that's what's being passed in here by default. If I want to actually pass the ID in, what I have to do is on the on click here, instead of calling on delete directly, we call a function and then call on delete and pass in the task.id. So now, if I click on one of these, I get delete 1, delete 2, delete 3. So we're able to now click on these and call this function, which is in the app.js where we have access to the state. All right, now in order to actually delete, get rid of that console log, so we want to call set tasks, because that's how we deal with our immutable state. And we're going to take the tasks that are already there and just filter. So dot filter is a high order array method. You should really know this stuff before getting into React, but basically this takes in a function. So we'll say for each task I want to filter, so we're going to filter where, let's say, task dot ID. If the task ID is not equal to the ID, that's what I want to show. I don't want to show the task with the ID because we're deleting it. Okay, so this is just within the UI. So if we save that and I reload and I click on the X here, you'll see that it goes away because it's filtering out, it's setting the tasks to the filtered tasks. All right, now if I wanted to make it so it shows like a message if there's no tasks, I could go down to here and wrap this in curly braces, and I could say if tasks dot length, if it's greater than 0, then show tasks, else show nothing. So if I save that, wait, what am I doing? If task.length, else show nothing. No, I want to show no tasks to show. All right, so there we go. So if there's nothing there, it's just going to give us that message. If I reload, they're all going to come back because remember, this is just the UI. That's what React does. You can turn this into a full stack application by having a back end, some kind of API that you can make requests to and fetch data from, which we might do at the end with something called JSON Server. All right, so we're able to delete these. Now, let's do the reminder. I want to be able to double click and add a specific class. And if you look in the CSS, I have a class called reminder with a green border on the left. So basically what we want to happen is when we double click, we want to change whatever task we're double clicking, change the reminder to the opposite of whatever it's set, and if it's true, have that border. So I'm going to again start in the app.js just like we just did with the delete, and let's say toggle reminder, and we'll create a function here. Let's call it toggle reminder, and it's going to need the ID because it needs to know which one to toggle. All right, actually let's call it reminder. No, that's fine. So toggle reminder, and for now, again, I'm just going to console log the ID, and we need to pass this down just like we did with the delete. So inside task, let's say on, we'll say on toggle and set that to toggle reminder, and then in tasks also pass in the prop of on toggle, or I should say catch the prop, and then here pass in a prop of on toggle, set that to on toggle, and then inside task what we want to do is on the div, okay, not on the delete button, obviously we want to do this on the main div. So I'm going to add, let's say on double click, and we're going to set that to, and this should get passed in on toggle. So on double click, we're going to call on toggle. All right, now again, we need the ID, so let's just do a function and then call on toggle and pass in the ID. So now ID is not defined. That's because it should be task.id, because we're passing in the task as a prop. All right, so now if I double click one of these, it's going to show the ID. So when I double click, it runs this right here. Now, what do we want this to do? We want this to, of course, toggle the reminder either from true to false or from false to true. So there's a bunch of ways you can do this. I'm going to use, of course, we need to use set tasks, and I'm going to use map. So we're going to say tasks, which is our state, or tasks in our state, and we want to map through. And for each one, we'll call it task. And I'm going to say where the task.id. So if the task ID that we're, in the current iteration is equal to the ID that's passed in, then we're going to have a specific object. Else, it's just going to be the task. It's no change, right? Because we only want to change the one that we're dealing with. So for the one that we're dealing with, the object I want to copy, or I should say spread across all of the task properties and values, but I want to change the reminder. So the reminder I'm going to set to the opposite of whatever that specific task reminder is. If it's false, it'll be true. If it's true, it'll be false. So I'm going to go ahead and save that. And I haven't even used the React Dev Tools yet. So if we go down to components here, we can see our component tree. We have each task, and if you hover on that, you can see the different props, the task itself, on toggle, on delete. What I want to look at is, we could look at this, but let's look at app, and you can see our state right here, which is our 3 tasks. And if I look at the first one, doctor's appointment, reminder is set to true. Now if I double click, now it's set to false, okay? Because we double clicked, it called this function, and we set that particular task to change the reminder to the opposite of what it was. If I click it again, it goes to true. So we know that's working, but there's nothing in the UI that lets us know that. So what we'll do is go back into task, and remember we have that specific class of reminder that will add a border to the edge. So let's go. So we have class name equals task. What I'm going to do here is make this into an expression and some backticks. And I still want the task class. That's going to be there no matter what. And then I want a condition here. So in template literal here, we're going to say if the task dot reminder is true, then we're going to have the class of reminder. Else, then it's just going to be nothing. So if I save that, you can see the first two have the green border because those are true. If I double click, it goes away. Double click again, comes back. Okay, so this is coming down from our state, this task, and we're checking the reminder. Okay, so we can just toggle these and we can delete them. Now it goes back to the default because we're just setting, this is just kind of like static data that we have as our default data. If you were using a back end, you'd be making fetch requests or HTTP requests to your server as well. So now let's start to work on the add form, because we haven't even created that yet. So in components, I'm going to create add, let's call this add task.js. And we'll go ahead and create a component. Now this is going to be a form. So instead of a div, this will be a form. We'll give this a class name of add-form. And then each label and input is going to be wrapped in a class of form controls. So let's say div class name and set that to form control, and then we'll have a label. So this label will just say task for the label, and then input will have a type of text, and let's add a placeholder and set that to add task. Okay, there's other stuff we're going to add to this, but I just want to get the form displayed for now. So I'm going to copy this form control down twice, and this next one is going to be the day. We'll say day and time. Type is text, and then for this we'll just say add day and time. Then this one is going to be, let's say, reminder or set reminder. And it's going to be a checkbox. So let's change the type to checkbox and get rid of the placeholder. We don't need that. And then I just want to have a submit. So we'll do an input with the type of submit. And then let's have a value. The value will be save or save task. All right, so we'll save that, and then let's just we'll embed this into our app.js. So I'm going to copy this down and set that to add task, set that to add task, and then right below, let's see, right below the header, add task. Now if I save that, we should see our form. Oh, one thing I forgot is some classes, just the styling. So the checkbox form control, I also have form control. I think it's just form control check. Yeah, and then for the button down here, the input submit, let's say class name, and that's going to be set to BTN and BTN block. Okay, just make that look a little better, and let's just open up our console, make sure we have no errors. All right, now each input is going to have its own piece of state, component level state, not app level state. So let's bring in useState from, not const, what am I doing? Import useState from React, and then right above the return, we're going to have, first one is text, and set text is the method to update the state. The default is just an empty string, and then we have set day for the day input, and then we have reminder, set reminder, and the default for reminder is going to be false. All right, so we have that. Now down in the input, the first one of text, let's go right here, and the value of this is going to be the text from the state, but we also need an on change, because when you start to type in the input, that's going to fire off this on change. It's a controlled component. So this is going to have a function. We're going to pass in the event object and directly call set text from here and set it to e.target.value, which is going to be whatever's typed in. All right, so I'm going to copy this value and on change and go to the next one of day, except this is going to be day instead of text, and the function to change that is going to be set day, and again it'll be set to the target value, which is whatever's typed in. So checkbox, I'll paste that in. This is going to be the reminder state, and this will be set reminder, right? And then instead of target.value, because this isn't an input, it's a checkbox, we can get current target.checked, which will give us either a true or false value if that's checked or not. All right, so that should clear up if I reload. Now to check this, if we go to our React Dev Tools, so down here where it says components, we can see all of our components, and if we go to add task, we should be able to see our state. So right here you can see each one of these is the 3 inputs. If I start to type in the text, and I say text because that's what we called that piece of state, we can see it down here. If I type in a day, we can see that. If I check set reminder, you can see that that changes. All right, so we know that's working. Now as far as submitting this, we're going to have a function in our app.js because we're going to be dealing with our tasks. So let's put this above the delete. We'll say add task, and let's say const add task. So for now, let's just do a console log. It's going to take in, as far as what this takes in, we'll just say task, And yeah, we'll just console log that. Now we have to pass this in, or we have to pass a prop into add task, let's say on add, and then that's going to call add task. Okay, now in our add task component, we want to take in on add, and what I'm going to do is add a submit event here, so on submit, and set that to on submit. And then on submit is going to be defined in here, const on submit, because there's a few things we need to do, so we're not calling on add directly. So on submit, that's going to take in the event object because we need to e.prevent default so it doesn't actually submit to a page. And then once we do that, I just want to do a little bit of validation for the text, the task text. So let's say if, and we'll say if not text, then, whoops. And we're talking about this piece of state which is connected to this input. So if that's not there, then let's do an alert and say please add a task and then return. All right, if that passes, then we're going to call on add, and we want to pass in into on add, we want to pass in an object with the text, the day, and the reminder. Okay, then I also want to clear the form, so I'm going to just call set text again and clear it, and then we want to clear day, set day, and then set reminder, which is a Boolean, so that's going to get set to false. All right, now I want it to be unchecked if it's false, so down here where we have our check, checkboxes can take in a checked value which will be true or false. So I'm going to say if reminder, so if that's true, then actually no, we can just set it to reminder. Yeah, so we'll save that. Okay, now when I submit this, what should happen is it should check to see if text is there. So if I don't have that filled in, I'll get an alert. Then it should call on add, which is just going to call add task, which up here is going to console log the task. So let's open up our console, and we're just going to type whatever in here and save. So the form also cleared, and down here you can see that we have our data. Now instead of console logging, we want to add this to our state. So in order to do that, I mean there's a bunch of ways we could do that. I do want to add an ID, since we're not dealing with a back end where it creates an ID on its own. I'm just going to do something really simple here and use math.floor, which will round down math. We'll say math.random. We'll make it up to like 10,000 and +1. So that should just give me a random number. So if we console log ID and I just submit this, it should just log a random number. Good. So we have an ID. So now I'm going to just create, let's say, new task. And this new task is going to be an object with that ID. And then I'm going to copy whatever the task text, day, and reminder, which is passed in here. I'm going to add that to the object as well. All right. Then we want to use set tasks, and we're going to set it as an array. We're going to copy the current tasks that are already there, but then we also want to add the new task onto it. All right, so let's save that, and now we should be able to add a new task. I'll just say test1, test2, set reminder, save task, and there it is. And we can change the reminder, we can delete it, so now we're able to add it. Cool, so the next thing I want to do is this button here should toggle this form. We want it to start off not showing, but then we want to click this, show it, click it again to toggle it. So we're going to have another piece of state in our app.js. And we're going to call that, let's say const, let's say, what do we want to call this? We'll say showAddTask, and then set showAddTask, which is going to be a Boolean. So set this to useState, set it to false by default. And then this form is going to be dependent on that piece of state. So down where we're embedding add task, let's wrap this in curly braces and say if showAddTask is true, then show that component. Now this is just a shorter way of doing a ternary without an else. Okay, we don't need an else, we just want to see if it's true. If it is, do this. If not, nothing. So we'll save that, and now it's not showing. Now if I set the default of that showAddTask to true, then it's going to show it by default. All right, now we want this button to toggle that, so we're going to have to do a couple things with that. Now that button is inside of the header, so if we go down to header, let's have a prop called onAdd. Now when that's fired off, we'll have a function and we'll call set showAddTask. We want to set it to the opposite of whatever the value is, so the opposite of showAddTask. Now onAdd is going to get passed into header as a prop, so let's say onAdd, and right now the button on click is just set to this right here, on click. We just want to get rid of that and change on click to onAdd. So if we save that, and let's just open up our console here as well. So if we save that, I click add, it shows the form. I click it again, it goes away. Okay, now I think we should also change the button if it's open, change the text to close. We could even change the color. So to do that, let's see, we'll go back to app.js, and where we have our header, in addition to the onAdd prop, let's also just pass in whatever the value of showAddTask is. So we'll set showAddTask to whatever showAddTask. Actually, we can just call this prop showAdd. All right, and then back in the header, say showAdd, and it's just going to be either true or false if it's being shown or not. So if it is, let's see, so the text right now just says add. Let's change that to be dynamic, and we'll say if showAdd. So if that's true, that means we want to show close, right? Because it's being shown. Else, then we'll show add. So I'll save that, and now it says close. If I click it, now it says add. Now I'll also change the color. It's set to green right now, so we'll change that. Let's say if show add, then let's make it red. Else, then we'll make it green. So now it's red, close it, now it's green. So you can see how this is where React is really valuable. It allows you to make really dynamic interfaces, and no pages are being reloaded or anything like that. So I mean, this is a really small application, but you can see the value in this. And I mean, it might be a little intimidating at first, but you really get the hang of it, and you see how valuable it is. To do stuff like this in vanilla JavaScript it's just very messy and unorganized and much more difficult. So let's see what's next. We can show our add form, we can add, we can delete, we can set toggle. I think that we're pretty much done as far as like just the UI goes. I would like to get into some HTTP stuff dealing with a back end. There's something called JSON Server that we can use. It's kind of a mock back end. So I think that will do that. But before we get into any of that, like making requests, I just want to show you how you would actually build your static assets out if you're ready to deploy. So And it says right here, use yarn build or npm run build, depends on if you use yarn or npm. But if I go ahead and I'm going to stop the server for a second, and you'll see that this, if I reload, doesn't work. And I'm going to run npm run build. And it's going to create an optimized production build in a folder called build. And this is going to be your static assets. This is what you would deploy. And this used to confuse me when I first got into React, or any framework like this. Do I deploy my components folder, or does the browser see that? It was kind of confusing, but no, that's all your development stuff. Build is where your build folder. That's where you push to production. Now, if you want to try this locally, you could install the npm serve package globally. So we can go ahead and do that. So let's say npm install -g. Actually, if you're on a Mac or Linux, you'll have to use sudo for permissions, because we're installing this globally, and then serve. And this is just a basic HTTP server. So I should now be able to serve, let's say serve -s, and then the build folder. And then I want to serve it on a port, let's say -p8000. All right, so now if I go to, and remember, localhost 3000 isn't working, that's our dev server. If I go to 8000, there it is. All right, so this now, if you look at the React DevTools icon, it's blue, not orange, and it says this page is using the production build. So this is your production build. This is what you would deploy. I could delete all the rest of these folders right now, and this would still work, because this is our production build. All right, I hope that makes sense. So I'm going to stop this, and if you want to stop here, that's fine. I'm going to keep going so that you can see how to deal with kind of a mock backend. Now, there's a really cool tool called JSON Server, and it basically allows us to create a mock REST API with our own data. So we install it. We're not going to install it globally. We'll install it locally. And then you can create a db.json with some resources, and you can make post requests, put requests, patch, and all that, just like as if it were a real backend built with Node.js and Express or Django or Laravel or whatever it might be. So before we start our React server back up, let's say npm install JSON-server. And this will install it locally, so it's going to get put in our package.json. If you clone this repository, it'll be included in here. Now, we need a way to run this, so I'm actually going to create another script here called server. And this is going to run JSON-server and --watch. And then the port, I'm going to run this on 5000 because I believe the default port is 3000. And we also have to put the name of the file, db.json. All right, so this will run our server. We can pretend that this is like a real backend that we created, a REST API. So let's run here, npm run server. And you can see it actually created a db.json with some posts. We're going to delete this stuff. But we also want to run our dev server as well. So I'm going to open up a new tab and run npm start. That's our React dev server. And the idea is we want to get data from here into here. So first of all, let's change this data up. So this is going to be tasks. And we'll get rid of that. We just want our brackets. And then I guess what we can do is just copy excuse me, copy from app.js these objects. Oops. These task objects. We'll cut those out. And this is the useState right here for tasks is going to be just an empty array. If I save that, we're going to see no tasks to show, and that's fine. So here I'll paste those objects in. However, we need to change these to JSON objects, which means that the keys have to have double quotes and any strings have to have double quotes. So just add these, and no trailing commas either. Get rid of that. Now, JSON Server actually creates IDs for you just like a real database, just like a real backend would. So we're not going to even have to worry about creating IDs. All right. So that looks good. Now, let's see, close that up. So the first thing we'll do is let's fetch our tasks from the back end, and you can even do this right from your browser, http localhost 5000/tasks, and there we go. And we can also make post, put, and delete requests. So in order to load them when the page loads, we're going to use a hook called useEffect, which is used to create side effects or deal with side effects, and it's often used to if you want something to happen right when the page loads. So we'll use this right below where we did our useStates, say useEffect, and this takes in an arrow function, and we're going to be using the fetch API with a sync await. Now we can't do a sync like this on this function, so we have to create one in here. Let's call it, let's say fetch tasks, and set that to a sync. And then here, let's say const response or res equals await, because fetch returns a promise, so we want to await that promise, and http localhost port 5000/tasks. Okay, then we want the data, so const data equals, we want to await res.json, that'll give us the JSON data. We'll console log the data, and then of course we have to call fetch tasks. All right, so we'll save that. We also want to add a dependency array here. If you have a value where you want this to run, if that value changes, you would pass it in here, like user or something. We don't have any dependencies, but you want to pass in just an empty array. All right, so now you can see as soon as the page loads, we're getting this data, and we're getting it from our JSON server, which you could replace with any backend. So instead of just console logging, we want to set this data as our state. However, I don't want to have fetch tasks in useEffect because I might want to use this somewhere else. So I'm not going to call set tasks right here. What I'm going to do is return the data, and then I'm going to take this out, cut that out, and just put it right below of useEffect. Fetch data from, actually let's just say fetch tasks. Okay, and then what we'll do is instead have a function called get tasks, and it's going to be async because we're going to call fetch task, which returns a promise. So here, let's say we'll do const, we'll call this tasks from server, and then we want to await fetch tasks, and then from there we'll call set tasks, which will add it to our state, and we want to add tasks from server, and then instead of calling fetch tasks here, we're going to call get tasks. All right, so if I save that, what's this? Each list should have a unique key prop. This should have a unique key prop. Should have the ID. Let me console log what we're getting here. Yes, we have the ID, and then in our component tasks, PID. I'm not sure why. Not sure what I'm missing here. I guess we could use the index if, let's say index. All right, so that gets rid of that. So we're able to fetch our tasks from the back end and display them. So the next thing I want to do is be able to delete them. So we already have a delete, and it's going to delete from the UI just fine. But if I reload, they're back because we haven't deleted them from the server. So let's go down to where we have our delete. So we have delete task, and this is going to be pretty simple because we just need to make a simple delete request right before we, filter through the UI. So let's go ahead and make this an async function, and we're going to just await. We don't need to save it in a variable because we're not getting any data back, but we're going to call fetch, and here we're going to use backticks HTTP localhost 5000 / tasks / and then the ID. Now we want to add a second argument of an object where we specify the method of this request to be a delete. All right, so we'll go ahead and delete that, and it will filter from the UI. So let's save that, and let's delete food shopping. So it deletes from the UI. If I reload, it's gone. Okay, and we should see, if we look in where our JSON server is running, you can see all of the different requests that are made and all of the responses. So we'll just keep that open as well. So next thing, let's see, we're able to list them, delete them. Let's do we'll do the add. Okay, so we want to be able to add a task and have it persist to our back end. So let's see, we have our add task right here. Now again, we're not going to need to create an ID because it assigns an ID for us. So we can actually just, what I'll do is I'll comment this out just in case you guys need it, and I'll go above it. Okay, so we're going to want to response, and we want this to be async, and then await fetch, and we're adding a task, so the route is going to be HTTP localhost 5000 / task, and it's going to be a post request, so we want to add here a method of post. Since we're adding data, we need to add headers because we need to specify our content type, and that's going to be application /JSON. And then we also want to set, outside of headers, we want to set the body that we're sending, the data we're sending, which we're going to wrap in JSON.stringify, which is just going to turn it from a JavaScript object into a JSON string. And what we're sending is the task, and that's getting passed in here. All right, so that's the request response. Then we want to, let's get the data here, say res.json. Now the data that's returned is just the new task that's added. So then once we do that, we want to call set tasks again. We want to set it, remember tasks is the entire array. We're going to take the existing tasks, and then we're going to add onto it data, which is the new task that was just created. So let's save that, and let's go over here and we'll say, I don't know, we'll say take test Monday and set reminder. So we'll save task. All right, so that didn't seem to work. Okay, so it did work on the server side, but this part didn't work. Oh, we didn't await. So this is a promise. We have to make sure we await res.json. All right, so let's delete take test. That should persist, and then we'll say take test. We'll say Friday this time, and there we go. So now it gets added to the UI, or added to the server, and then added to the UI. Okay, so that's all set. Now, one thing I noticed was in my db.json, the second one here just had a D and not an ID, and I think that was the reason why I was getting that key error earlier. So just make sure that each one has an ID. All right, now the last thing we want to do here in terms of working with the server is updating the reminder. So if I double click that, it works in the UI, but it doesn't, we haven't made a request to the server. So that's going to happen in toggle reminder, but first I want to be able to get a single task from the server. So I'm going to go up here where I have fetch tasks and just copy that. It's going to be very, very similar, just called fetch task singular, and it's going to take in an ID, and we want to change these to backticks and do /ID. Okay, so we have fetch task, and then we're going to go down to toggle reminder, and it's basically just an update. We're not able to update like the name. You can add that on if you want. We're just updating a single field, but it's done the same way, really. So let's first go ahead and create, we'll say task to toggle. So which one do we want to grab? So that's going to come from, let's say, await fetch task singular and pass in the ID. Now this has to be a sync. So we're going to get the task to toggle, then we're going to put it into a variable, the updated task, which is going to be an event. It's going to have all the same properties of task to toggle, so we're just spreading those across here. In addition to that, we want to change reminder to whatever the opposite of task to toggle dot reminder is. We want reminder. Okay, so we haven't made any requests or anything. We're just getting the task and then creating the new task and putting it in a variable. Now, let's say const res equals await fetch, and let's see, we're doing an update, so we're going to want the ID. So HTTP localhost port 5000 /task /ID. Then we want to add a method of put, since this is an update. We want to add headers since we're sending data. We want the content type of the data we're sending, application /JSON. And whoops, not here, but under headers, we want the body, which is the data we're sending, wrapped in JSON.stringify to turn it into a string, and it's going to be the task. The updated task. All right, then we want to just data await on the response JSON. And then the only thing we want to change right here is the reminder. We're setting it to whatever the data reminder, because the data that we get back is just the updated task. So whatever that is, true or false, we're going to have here if it matches that ID. So let's save that and let's open that up. So I'm going to double click meeting at school. You can see down here, put request to task 2, 200 response. So if I reload, it stays off or it stays false. If I make them all true and reload, that stays. All right, so we're now able to interact with our server in all ways. We can delete, we can add, we're fetching our data. So this is what you would do in a full stack app, except instead of using JSON Server, you would build your own REST API with whatever language and framework you choose. All right, now one thing we haven't gotten into is routing, and that's the last thing I want to cover. So we've done everything just within this one page right here, this one view really. So to use routing, there's no routing included with the core library. I'm just gonna, let's see, I'll just open a new tab here. So we use a package called React Router DOM. So let's npm install react-router-dom. And that's going to show up in our package.json. Okay, so there it is. Now, in our app.js, if we look at what we're returning, let's go back down here, look at what we're returning. We have a container with our header, our add task, which is dependent on this value, our tasks component, which will show if there actually is any tasks, and then that's pretty much it. So I want to first of all add a footer, and I want to have in that footer a link to an about page that has an about component. So in components, let's create a new file called footer.js, and we'll go ahead and create a component here. We'll get rid of this. So this footer is going to be pretty simple. I'm just going to change this to footer, and then let's put a paragraph, and we'll just say copyright ampersand copy semicolon 2021, and then under that I'm going to have a link to, this is going to go to /about. I'm going to change this after, but we'll just have that for now. And then we're going to bring this into our app.js up at the top. So import, actually I'll just copy header down and change that to footer. And we're just going to embed this down here in our return. All right, so there's our footer. Now for routes, let's create our about first, about component. So about.js. So this is going to be really simple. I'm just going to put an h4 and say the version 1.0.0, and then we'll put let's put a link to go back. That'll go to /go back. All right. Now this about component I'm going to bring into app.js. And of course I could just embed it like we've been doing, but I want to use the router. So we need to bring in, let's say import from react router DOM, and what we want to bring in are two things. We want to bring in browser router, which will use the HTML5 push state. I'm going to give it an alias of router though, and then we also want to bring in route. So to use the router, we have to wrap everything in our output. So in our return right here, we're going to wrap everything in router. All right, so I'm going to grab that and put that down here. So now since we wrap that in router, we can use routes. So right above the footer, I'm going to say route and pass in a path of /about, and then pass in a component, and that component is going to be about. Now if I save that, if I click on about, I can see the about component. I can see the other ones as well because they're just embedded up here. So any route we create, we're always going to see those, which I want to change. Now it's not going to be as easy as just labeling a component because I want to put the add task component and the tasks component all in one route, all in the index route. So to do that, we can say route and path set to /. We also want to add exact, or else if we go with the about, it's going to do the same thing and show this, just because it's going to first match the /. So we want to match this exactly. And then instead of component, we can use render. And inside render, it just takes an arrow function with props, and we'll point this function to a set of parentheses, and in here we're just going to have a fragment, and then we can take whatever we want, which is going to be the add task and the tasks. So we'll cut those, and we're going to put that right in here in this route render. Now if I save that, you can see we're on /about, right? And we don't see the other stuff. If we go back, now we see the add and the tasks. All right, so let's see. Next thing, notice when I click on about or go back, see how the reload, and up here, see how the page reloads? We don't want that. So to stop that from happening, instead of using an A tag, for instance, let's go to the about page. Instead of using an A tag, we're going to use link from React Router DOM. So let's say import link from React Router DOM, and then we just replace the A tag with link and replace href with 2. All right, we're going to do the same thing. Where else do we have this? In the footer, where we're linking to the about page. We're going to do the same thing and change that to link and change that to 2. And now you'll notice if I click about or go back, it doesn't reload, it's just instant. So you want to make sure if you're using routes that you use link as opposed to just regular link, A tags. All right, and you can obviously create as many components as you want and as many routes. You can also put multiple components with props like we did here. The last thing, if we go to about, we still see this add, which doesn't make sense. So to get rid of that, we could go to our header. So in our header, there's something called useLocation. It's actually a hook that we can use from React Router DOM. So I'm gonna import useLocation from React Router DOM, and this allows us to basically look at the route that we're currently on. So above the return here, let's just create a variable called location, and we'll set that to useLocation, and then we should have access to location.pathname. So where we have this button, let's wrap it in curly braces so we can add a condition, and we'll say if location.pathname is equal to /, then we'll go ahead and show the button. All right, so I'll save that, and now notice on the about page the button's gone. If I go back to the index, there it is. All right, so you can check out whatever the path name is or the route is, and you can do certain things based on that route. All right, so that's routing, and I think that's it, guys. I mean, we covered a lot. This was a long video, longer than I expected, and I actually wanted to do routing before we did all the HTTP stuff with JSON Server, so I apologize for that. I kind of forgot about it. So that's it. Hopefully this taught you something, even if you didn't catch everything. If this is your first time dealing with React and this just looks like a horror show to you, don't worry about it. You're gonna get more familiar with it as you learn it, as you watch more videos. I have an entire playlist of different projects. I have 3 Udemy courses if you're interested, MERN-STAT courses, and so on. And there's just tons of content out there, the documentation, look at other people's code, you know, to get examples, to kind of learn what's going on. So there's a lot of things you can do, so don't get overwhelmed if this looks really hard. But that's it. Thanks for watching, guys. I really appreciate it if you lasted this long, and I will see you next time.